The Crystal Charter, Daughter of the Red Seal. Read and written by Rebecca Sewell. Chapter 5. The office was too dark. The scant light that battled its way in through the small windows had to struggle through wooden blinds, only to be absorbed by the darkness of the furniture. 2 of the walls were occupied with heavy bookcases, glutted with neatly organised ledgers, a large portion of which were the regulations and oft-issued amendments on magical items that could be transported via the Red Seal ships. There was a collection of magical items behind a glass panel, including a selection of uncharged and charged crystals. Some had been kept in their natural state, and others had been carved into pristine shapes. Everything had detailed note tags describing what they were used for, or some lore they bypassed and why. Most were only small trinkets: opalescent scales from an adolescent mermaid, a smooth warming crystal, an iron wand with a chunk of raw green crystal stuck on one end. Maebe noticed her daggers trapped behind the glass, reduced to beautiful ornaments. On a huge table in the centre of the room sat a grand navy blue globe. Etchings of the constellations glowed with the light of the crystal inside it. The penumbra left moving patterns illuminated on the ceiling. Maebe had fond memories of the office as a child. "What colour crystal can hold the least amount of power?" her father would ask from over the desk, without raising his head. "Red," Maebe would chirp back, and then she would continue, knowing he would look up from his work to give her a beaming smile. "They can only release power for up to a few hours. Purple is the strongest for regular people. The royal family can use an era crystal. They have no colour. Only with permission from the king, too." She would gaze up at her father's proud face over a book so big that she had opened it on the floor, laying on her stomach to read. After her mother's death, the memories felt colder, like someone had let a draught blow through her mind. Maebe would sit in her father's chair at the oversized desk, and he would pace behind her, drilling her with instructions or questions. "Give me word for word the first agreement in the Crystal Charter," he would demand. The main point behind the Crystal Charter is the simplest. All magic generated in green must be accessible to both magic creators and non-magic creators, she would reply in a monotone voice. "Give a practical example." "Say, a witch is in a library and they wanted a book from across the room. They couldn't just float the book over to them using their own powers. They would have to charge a crystal, then use the crystal to float the book over to them, using their own powers contained within the crystal. This means, should a human sit next to them, they could pick up that same crystal and float a book towards themselves too. Despite humans not being able to generate magic. Obviously, the human should have manners and at least ask to use the crystal." She grinned at her own observation, but quickly focused once she realised her father ignored it. "What is the importance of this rule?" he would barrel on. "That magic is spread equally." "Partly, but what is the main reason?" "To give humans access to magic. To keep humans safe, maybe. The kingdom was quite literally torn apart by horrific wars generations ago, and the Charter was created to keep humans safe. Using a crystal channels power in a safe way, not affected by emotion. It makes it clear to tell if the magic has been corrupted or used for malicious purposes. And witches benefit from trading their most basic forms of magic. It makes it available to those with weak powers and humans." He would sigh and let his hand squeeze her shoulder. "Let's review the limits on potions and why they are different to crystals." Maebe stopped studying with her father after his accident. She hadn't visited the office in weeks, but was unsurprised to see that nothing had changed. Her father spent most of his time hiding in this room, but it was as stagnant as the rest of the manor. Clean, organised, and arranged meticulously for its purpose, but unchanging. A perfect representation of her future. Her father's eyebrow was twitching as he sat in the padded chair. She met his leer across the wide rift of mahogany that spread between them. He wanted to treat Maebe as though she were a disobedient sailor or a dishonest trader. Sitting across from him in his office altered their usual routine of dinner-time bickering. He was a serious knave-arch, facing an issue, not her loving father. You left her. He exhaled noisily through his nose whiskers and turned a dark stare towards Maebe, hands steepled in front of his chest. Yes, I left her. It wasn't like I left her in one of the swamps to be devoured by a thryer. I left her in a tea house in the upper side of the city. She held his glare, simmering her irritation at how ridiculous this conversation would be. She isn't used to city life. She panicked and didn't know what to do, because you left her. You knew she didn't know her way around the city. Well, she should know her way round by now. She's lived in Elpis long enough. This isn't about her. Maebe's father shouted the words at her. It was an effort not to shrink into the chair. She had seen his temper in the past, but rarely directed at her. Maebe lowered her eyes to the desk, making a conscious effort to keep her chin up, her expression blank. This is about you. You're too old to be acting like a spoiled child. I am not acting like a spoiled child, she yelled back, hating that every word would reinforce his opinion. Yes, you are. God's beyond, it's probably my fault. A single withered hand rubbed his eyes, and his voice lost its angry edge. When did he get so old? I don't know how to raise a daughter. I gave you everything you wanted. I never denied you a thing. Fine horses, clothes, crystals. Weapons training, May? When will you ever need that? I have no idea, just because Prince Mouse was doing it, he scoffed. Maebe bit back a retort that when she had requested to attend training with the princess and princes at the palace, he had thought it a good idea. She had stood at the office door in a new summer dress, shoeless feet firmly planted, hands balled up, and demanded it, expecting him to say no. Anyone who shares a border with the Blight should know how to hold a blade, he had once chuckled over some paperwork, then shooed her along. I taught you everything I can about our family's work, and more than that, I taught you how to be good at it. Yet you do not respect our position. His shaky hands rubbed through his greying hair. I do, Father. All we have to do is make a yearly boat ride. All we have to do, May. This is the second year you have abandoned your duty. I allowed you a respite last year, and it cost me. I did not think you would play your silly games this year. Not after you offended the king so, he barked. Maebe chose not to answer. She refused to be lured into an argument about marriage again, hoping he wouldn't take the heat in her face as anything else but anger. We owe everything to the crown, everything. You're getting too old to behave the way you are. You need to continue the Sumine line. We're the only two, you and I. He looked at her with a glint of apology in his eyes. I can't do this forever. I don't know how much longer I can keep you. He cut himself off, breathing deeply. The king expects an heir. In marrying, certainly, it bought us, you, time, but I cannot provide one. He unwittingly glanced to his legs. You need to find a husband. What happened between you and Prince Mouse, May? You two were so close. She knew he was trying to appeal to her, and it could have worked, but this was a conversation she couldn't endure yet. Not when she hadn't quite mended the bond between her and Mouse. Don't, Papa. I'm not willing to marry someone just because it's what everyone expects of me. And don't tell me you marrying that wallflower had anything to do with me. You didn't even tell me you were thinking of taking another wife, and then you come home with her. Maebe's voice was rising as she spoke, despite the quivering of her lower jaw. I thought she might be a good influence on you, May. I thought you might like a human female companion, not one of those witches or a heartless royal courtier. Maebe was failing to see any reason strong enough for her to grasp onto. Her father was just stuttering at half-truths. I thought she would help to liven the house a bit more, not drive you out of it. Maybe I thought it would. The fact you can say any of that shows just how little you thought about anything. It should have been Mama here. Her voice was quiet. Hot tears lined her eyes. They rarely talked about her mother. She was at the centre of the void between them. "It should have been," he whispered back, turning callous in a blink. "If it was your mother sitting here, what would you be doing?" His gaze became cold, distant, and when he spoke, it was as if this was a drill of her knowledge, not the most intimate pain they both shared. "What do you mean? She's not, and she never will be," Maebe asked, dazed by his sudden change of demeanour. "If it had been me who died, not your mother, what would you be doing?" He questioned her in icy tones. Maebe shook her head, the movement freeing the heavy tears down her cheeks. "You would be the one preparing to head south right now. You would have been the one making the trip once a year since you were 9 years old. Your mother married into the Sumines, so she couldn't have gone in your stead. Do you ever think about that?" Maebe didn't even consider replying. "She loved you so much. But do you think she would have talked the king out of forcing you into a marriage as soon as you had become a woman? Do you think she would have been able to protect you like I have?" "Papa, let me finish. I have spoiled you, May," he snarled, "in that I have shielded you from our contract as much as I can because I cannot bear to see you shoulder it alone for so long. In doing so, you don't know how to be daunted by this." It was all too much to absorb. He would sometimes ramble on about how he was scared of her taking on the responsibility by herself, but he'd never flaunted her mother's death to prove a point. "What are you on about?" Maebe demanded. "So I've got to make a boat trip once a year. I just want to pursue other things whilst I have a chance. I can still respect the family tradition." "It is not a tradition!" His hands slammed into the desk. "What have I just said?" "This is everything. I should have never let you skip out going south the first time. You should be learning as much as you can whilst I'm still here," he roared. "You'd have to lock me in the cabin." Maebe let her voice slowly drip the words like poison, trying to hide the fact she was losing grip on her breathing. Tears dried on her cheek. "Don't tempt me!" he bellowed. He lowered his face into his hands and pushed the loosened strands of his hair back before speaking in a lower voice again. "Keep your attitude to yourself and treat certainly with respect. Do not leave her unattended in the city again. If the Starling sisters hadn't noticed her, then who knows what she would have done. It's not my responsibility to babysit your incompetent wife just because you rediscovered you have no use for one. At least I try to make a conversation with her." She looked him up and down, distaste a heavy mask. "And as for Neris spent the afternoon insulting Mother to my face." "Just get out, Maebe," he ordered. Quiet. He expected to be obeyed. His face had settled into a seemingly unbreakable stony fixture. He had loved her mother fiercely, and Maebe knew she was all that was left of that love. It was the reason she had so much freedom and could demand so much from her father, even if he silently disapproved. She didn't obey. She wanted to test the boundaries of his affection after the threat he made. "Get out." He was physically shaking with rage, but managed to keep his voice low. It only made the mask more intimidating. Maebe stood, slowly, never taking her eyes from him. She turned to walk across the room with a fake calm. Opening the sturdy wooden door, she turned to make eye contact one last time as she stepped back across the threshold. Placing both hands on the edge of the door, she slammed it shut as hard as she could, sending a resounding sound through the manor.